Hello, my name is Maya Negami Hanford. I am a lecturer in Japanese Studies and Modern Languages at Cardiff University. Thank you for coming to the 8th Cardiff-Japanese Lecture Series, exploring socio-cultural aspects of Japanese language learning. We also would like to say thank you for the Japan Foundation London to supporting this lecture series. The purpose of this Cardiff-Japanese Lecture Series is to share contemporary relevant information and to understand cultural context for recognizing the multifaceted aspects of Japanese society in a broader sense. We aim to explore socio-cultural aspects of language learning for those studying Japanese language and culture, as well as various learners, teachers, and researchers with an interest in Japan. The 8th event in the Cardiff-Japanese Lecture Series today, this time with Dr. Jennifer Court from University of Sheffield. Dr. Court will give us the lecture on engaging with Japan beyond the stereotypes. And while the talk, you can give us your questions regarding the lecture using the Q&A function. And please type that question in the Q&A box. Then after the lecture finishes, we will review these questions. Also, you can upvote other people's questions so that we can prioritize the question. Okay, please, if you see the question that you are interested in, please push the upvote button. Okay, and also please do not type your question in the chat box. Thank you very much. And also, in the webinar, all your microphones will be muted, and this webinar is being recorded, and the recorded session video will be in the Cardiff Japanese Online Lecture Series YouTube channel. I'll be putting a link to you in the chat box later. And oh, hold on, I made this slide, but yeah, I have talked about this already, but yes, this is an extra slide to talk about today's schedule. Okay. And now let me introduce today's lecturer, Dr. Court's profile to you now. One sec, sorry. Yes, Dr. Jennifer Court is a senior lecturer in Japanese Studies at the School of East Asian Studies, University of Sheffield. She is the author of Making Icons, Repetition, and the Female Image in Japanese Cinema, 1945 to 1964. Published by Hong Kong University Press in 2016, and film viewing in post-war Japan, 1945 to 1968, and ethnographic study published by Edinburgh University Press, 2022, as well as a number of journal articles and book chapters on cinema and audiences in post-war and contemporary Japan. And she has studied, worked, and taught in Tokyo and Kyoto for over 6 years. Very excited. I'm very excited to learn from her today. So, okay, thank you so much, Jennifer, for giving us this opportunity today.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much. So I am going to stop sharing my slide here, so you can start sharing your slide, and yeah, and then when you're ready, please start your lecture.
Lovely, thank you. Hopefully you can see my slides now. Unfortunately, I can no longer see the chat. So if anything goes wrong or if my slides stop moving, please do just shout at me and I'll reset everything. But thanks so much for inviting me to contribute to this fantastic seminar series. I think it's such a nice idea to think about what kinds of maybe enrichment activities or different ways that we can engage with Japan alongside the study of Japanese language. Ironically, when I was using the design slides function to put this slideshow together, the very first option that I was offered for a talk titled Engaging with Japan Beyond the Stereotypes was cherry blossom. So I resisted the temptation to use that. I've gone with this kind of like Ikebana style design instead. But I think it's kind of interesting. I'm not quite sure how the PowerPoint design suggestions algorithm works, but it was interesting that whatever they'd picked up on in terms of what I was putting into my slides was prompting these kind of slightly stereotypical images. So going beyond those stereotypes is something that I'm going to try and think about a little bit together with you today. And I'm going to draw a little bit from my personal experience, not just my own research, but also the time that I have spent in Japan and engaging with Japan from the UK. So hopefully there will be something useful or interesting in there for you. So one of the things that I'm really thinking about here is how we engage with Japan as a society and as part of our globalized everyday life. So in this talk, I'm going to think a little bit about sort of beyond the study of Japanese language, what other ways can we engage with Japan from further study, which might be something that some of you are thinking about, to teaching, or even through creative practice. So throughout this talk, almost all of the photographs that I'm going to be sharing with you are actually from my own collection. I'm not a very good photographer, but one of the things that I learned the second time I moved to Japan was how important it is to kind of document sort of what was going on around me and spend a little bit of time sort of going through those images and giving myself sort of a second chance to understand what I was seeing and experiencing in Japan. The very first time I moved to Japan, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, I was using just, kind of basic phone camera. And the second time I decided to invest in a slightly better camera and some editing software, because I realized that sort of creative practice and trying to amass my own collection of photographs was a really useful way to think about engaging with Japanese culture outside of, focusing on the language. So we're going to think about different kinds of opportunities that are available to us as one of my teachers put it when I was an MA student, lifelong Japanese language learners, because I think no matter how much time we've spent studying the language, there's always more to learn, right? But there are ways of supplementing that language learning, I think, through other kind of activities as well. And we're going to think about how these activities and experiences can enrich your life, whether overseas or back in the UK. So hopefully, whatever you're planning to do when you finish your studies or sort of as your studies are going on, there might be something here that could be of use for you. I'm going to very briefly introduce myself, although actually Dr. Handford already did such a great job that this is probably slightly redundant. As she mentioned, I'm currently a senior lecturer in Japanese studies at the School of East Asian Studies. Before that, I worked at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures, which you may be familiar with. I believe one of your Cardiff alumni has also been publicizing the summer schools that the Sainsbury Institute run each year. Those are a really great opportunity, I think a great way to engage with Japan from the UK. So if that's ever something that you're interested in, I strongly recommend it. And before that, I worked in Kyoto University for 4 years as an assistant professor. So some of what I'm going to be sharing with you today is based on that experience of working in Japan as well. And my research and teaching kind of evolves mostly around film studies, gender studies, and post-war Japanese history. Although, as I mentioned, I spent quite a lot of time in Japan trying to make sure that I was making the most of contemporary cultural life, including things like art exhibitions. This is a picture of my mum visiting, and I took her to the Higashiyama Light Up Festival in Kyoto. As you can see, she looks thrilled to be there. Also where I get my nose from, I think. So yeah, this is kind of a diagram that I use sometimes to explain a little bit how my own research is situated. Obviously, I'm a lecturer in Japanese studies right now. My own kind of research practice draws from anthropology, but my background is actually in history of art. My undergraduate degree was not related to Japanese at all. I did a double degree in art history and English literature at the University of Glasgow that was very Europe focused. And I first became interested in Japanese culture when our Chinese art history professor went on sabbatical and was temporarily replaced by a Japanese art specialist, which I think kind of tells you maybe all you need to know about the place of East Asian art in that program at that time. I think it's very different now. But this was my first introduction to Japanese art, and I got really interested in ukiyo-e. And that's when I decided to pursue a master's in Japanese art history, which led to a PhD in Japanese film studies. And I'm now kind of a broad kind of cultural studies specialist, looking at media studies and history as well. So as you can probably tell, this meant that I actually started my research into Japan with no Japanese language whatsoever. And I was very, very nervous about that. I think in the first few, kind of degree programs that I undertook that focused on Japan, I, really threw myself into learning Japanese language. But I was faced with this really sort of challenging balance between, studying Japanese language for the first time at the age of 22, which is a lot harder than starting at the age of 18, I think. But also trying to make sure that I was doing enough, of my disciplinary study. So doing enough of my history of art study on my master's, and then doing enough of my film studies study on my PhD. So I'm really sensitive to this issue that Dr. Hanford really perceptively raises about how do you balance sort of your attempt to become really proficient in Japanese language alongside of maintaining a really good awareness of Japanese culture. And one of the things that I think we've all observed sometimes when you look to textbooks and things like this is that there can be really quite a lot of, maybe slightly stereotypical views of Japan and stereotypical views of different groups of people and different ways of behaving within Japanese culture that we see through, some of the examples that we get in textbooks. I'm thinking particularly about things like gendered language and things that we do need to learn as language learners, but that if we're not careful, I think can give us a little bit of a skewed idea of how everyday life in Japan might really be experienced for people living there. So I do think that complementing our language learning with some cultural studies is a really good way of moving beyond that. I mean, I think one of the real positives to studying Japanese culture, and admittedly I'm very biased here, is that we can really see, I think, when we study popular culture, how that kind of popular culture shapes our social imaginaries. One of the things that I quite like to do with my students in my Japanese media class is show them excerpts from Terrace House. I don't know if anybody is watching this, the kind of reality TV show that you can access through Netflix. And not actually the main parts of the show itself, but the way that the participants in the show are discussed by the talento and the comedians and the entertainment figures who sit in the viewing room, because I think this gives us a really good sense of how popular culture both shapes our social imaginaries and our ideas of the way that people should behave in the world, and then also is shaped by those ideas as well. So particularly, I think watching how different gendered behaviors or different kind of gendered personal expressions are discussed in the screening room outside of Terrace House gives you a really good understanding of the kind of gap between sort of the ways that everyday life might be depicted in things like TV shows and the way that people understand everyday interactions to play out in the, I guess, quote unquote, real world. So one of the questions that really underpins a lot of my research is, what does visual and material culture mean to viewers within the Japanese speaking world, past and present? And I say the Japanese speaking world there because my research has also encompassed, for example, wartime Japan and Japan's occupied territories. So thinking about where people outside of Japan have been in a position to consume Japanese popular culture, and how that kind of culture has been used to kind of shape identities and expectations. And I think questions like these really help us to understand how social attitudes and political ideologies develop, as well as introducing us to a range of different ways of kind of expressing oneself and expressing one's feelings in Japanese. I mentioned that when I first started my research, I was very nervous about the fact that I had begun learning Japanese language later in life. If you told me at 37 that I was going to refer to 22 as late in life, I think I would have questions for you. But one of the ways that I tried to work around that in my PhD study was to use materials like the magazine that you can see the front cover pictured here. This is the magazine Eiga Fan, And it's what we might think of as a kind of lowbrow or even maybe slightly trashy film magazine. In early post-war Japan, it ran from, I think, 1946 through to 1949. And one of the reasons that I use materials like this in that PhD kind of project was because they were aimed not at highbrow intellectual kind of readership, but at your everyday time poor, maybe teenagers, maybe sort of women working from home. And so I found that the language was a lot more accessible. There was a lot more furigana around kanji use, and there was actually less kanji use overall. There were also a lot of pictures, so I could draw from my art history experience to do a lot of visual analysis. And I felt then that I was able to continue learning Japanese and try to develop my Japanese language skills while drawing from my other strengths and also making sure that, I wasn't sort of getting into materials that I really, really couldn't understand. And one of the nice upsides to this, although this was a part of my project design that was really developed to cover for my own kind of failing, was that nobody had actually worked with these materials before. So when it came to turning my PhD into a book, this was an area in which I was able to contribute to my field of study, because there was quite a lot of work on the kind of highbrow cinema magazines like Eiga Geijutsu, for example, film art, or Kinema Jumpo. A lot of people were writing about how film was being theorized by contributors to those magazines, and in what way film directors were writing about their own work in those magazines, but nobody was really scrabbling around in these kind of, I guess, like Daily Mail equivalent publications, kind of looking at like what were more kind of everyday people and younger people being kind of told in the materials that they were dealing with. So this actually ended up being a contribution that I could make, even though I only began with these materials from a position of feeling very unconfident about my Japanese language skill. So this kind of, I guess, brings me to my first kind of point about the different pathways that you can take to engaging with Japan, and where Japanese language kind of fits within that, or is something that you can even pick up along the way there. So of course, many of you are studying Japanese language and or Japanese studies or East Asian studies at your universities. And you might even have had the opportunity to take advantage of student exchange programs at Japanese universities as well. I think this is a really rich way to build out your understanding of everyday Japanese life by spending time making friends with people in Japan and with Japanese people. You might also want to think about further study. So for myself, because I had not studied Japanese language at undergraduate or even at MA, I actually took a 2-year sort of break between my MA and my PhD study to do an intensive Japanese language course at a Japanese university. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in just a minute. While I was there, I was also eligible to apply for a funded MA in Japan. So I could have done a second MA there. I could have continued on to PhD, all under the same funding program. So there was really quite a lot of opportunity there, that particularly if spending more time in Japan is something that you're looking to do to kind of enhance your engagement with Japan, there's really a lot of funded opportunities and great opportunities there. Of course, a lot of people find English teaching, either on the JET program or for specific companies, to be a really good way of engaging. And of course, increasingly, I think we're seeing more internships, particularly in sort of the hotel and tourism sector, placements, and of course, the Daiwa program as a great opportunity for setting you up to work in Japan as well. Alongside of these kind of pathways, I think it's also helpful, if we're coming from a Japanese studies background, to think a little bit about how the history of Japanese studies has developed. And this might seem very, very obvious to you, but in my time kind of moving around different parts of the world, studying, researching, sometimes teaching, I'm constantly amazed at how different Japanese studies looks everywhere I go. In part, I think this is because Japanese studies has developed in different ways at different times and in different directions around the world. And of course, you're aware, I think, probably of those countries with leading Japanese studies, research and teaching. So this is a short, not exhaustive list of really interesting places to pursue Japanese studies, and to think a little bit about sort of why Japanese studies looks really different in these places. The US, of course, has a real strength, and that might be somewhere that you're thinking about for exchange or for further study. Around the UK, I think even, between Scotland, England, and Wales, we maybe have some slight differences in how Japanese studies is taught and how the history of Japanese studies has developed. Of course, Australia has a completely different relationship to Japan again, based on sort of their near neighbor kind of geographical relationship. And one of the things that I found quite interesting, even just traveling around Europe, particularly working with Japanese studies colleagues in Switzerland, is the huge differences between French, German, and Italian Japanese studies. Very different emphases on different parts of Japanese culture and different strengths, I think, as well. So, for example, if you're very interested in religion in Japanese studies, Italy might be a really good place to think about for a master's or for a PhD, or even just for a short exchange. Again, if you're thinking about film studies and the arts, particularly fine arts, France could be a really good place to pursue your studies. And of course, there's many, many more areas of the world teaching Japanese studies in very different ways than we do here in the UK. And of course, those of you who've already been on a year abroad in Japan will have noticed that Japanese studies is also taught in Japan, and taught again in a very different way. When I first arrived in Japan, I was very surprised to hear the phrase Higashi Asia to Nihon, because of course, in English, when we say East Asia, that includes Japan. So the idea that from the perspective of Japan, East Asia could be somewhere that is also kind of connected to Japan but separate was a kind of slightly mind-blowing experience for me. And I guess that kind of encapsulates what I'm trying to say here, which is wherever you pursue your study of Japan, it will reorient you in relation to Japan and ideas of Japaneseness. And that can be a really fruitful way to kind of move beyond maybe some stereotypical thinking or some kind of ways of considering Japan that might be embedded in our positionality from the UK, from Wales, England, or from Scotland. So Japanese studies looks different in different parts of the world, and our understanding of Japan is shaped by where we're studying as well as by what we study. So all these different kind of ideas of what Japan might mean are really, I think, shaped very much by the history of the place that we are engaging with Japan from, if that makes sense. To give you a concrete example, as you're probably aware, in the US, Russia, Britain, France, and Holland, those are all countries which used their fleets to force Japan to sign treaties that promised regular relations and trade from 1858. And so 19th century writing on Japan tended to be influenced by the commercial and legal relationships between the countries. And I think we can see that actually underpinning the position from which we begin Japanese studies here in the UK. Of course, another kind of major formative influence, I think, would be the Second World War. Into the 20th century, countries grouped together on the Allied or Axis sides of the Second World War would have had different views of Japan based on their different kinds of engagement with Japan. So these are just two kind of like bookend moments, I guess, in terms of thinking about engaging with Japan that really shape what Japanese studies looks like in different countries. I mentioned previously that I was going to give you just a few names of different exchange programs that would allow you to consider your study of Japan from Japan, if that's something that you're thinking about doing going forward in your studies. And so this is the program that I went on in between my master's and PhD. It's the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology. I feel like they add more elements to that title every time I look away. Known as MEX, sometimes in English, or Monbu Kagakusho or Monbusho in Japanese. And this is a fantastic program that provides scholarships to study in Japan at many levels. So you may have already had funding from the MEXT for your undergraduate exchange here. You can also think about postgraduate study, master's or PhD funded by MEXT. And this is the one that a lot of people don't think about. There's a scholarship called Researcher, so it's just called Kenkyusei. And a lot of people think that you have to be, you know, a lecturer at a university or a professional researcher to take up this program. You actually don't. The Researcher program is for people who haven't really kind of declared their program of study yet. And it gives you 18 months to 2 years of basically kind of free study time. You can do anything that you like with that. So for me, that's what I used to really intensively try to learn as much Japanese as I could in 2 years. I have other friends who are now colleagues who use this time to do some fieldwork towards their PhD study. I have some friends who used it as almost kind of like a shopping or thinking time towards deciding whether or not they wanted to do an MA. So this is a pathway that I think is really useful and flexible. And if you think, well, I can't apply for a scholarship because I don't really know what I want to do with myself after graduation, perhaps the Researcher program is for you because it's very, very flexible. You can take shorter planned trips to specific regions under this program as well. And if, like me, you're maybe coming to this program from not feeling very confident about the amount of Japanese that you already know, you can take classes in English as well. So one of the things I think that people sometimes don't think about is that you can learn Japanese while in Japan. So for those of you who might be joining this lecture not from a Japanese language program, this could be something that would be useful for you. You've probably, if you are on the Japanese language program, already taken advantage of some of these opportunities, but I thought that I would drop some of these sort of names and titles in here, just for those of you who might be thinking of this in the future. So of course, the JASO, Japan Student Services Organization, is a really good place to go if you're thinking about further study in Japan. And they really help to break down all the different pathways for you. You can see some of them listed here. I would say that comparatively speaking, I think based on my experience of studying and working in the UK, the US and Australia, as well as Japan, I have not seen the range of scholarships anywhere else that are available in Japan. So if you're thinking about sort of going to Japan for further study, but you're not quite sure about funding, I would really, really strongly encourage you to apply for some of these programs because the scholarship support is really quite comprehensive. And the success rates, I think, are a lot higher than they are in a lot of other places. So I'm kind of pushing, I guess, some of these options because I did these programs myself, as I mentioned, and I found them really, really just literally life-changing. I would not be doing what I do now if it wasn't for that first initial Monbusho Study Abroad program, which I did at Tokyo Gaidai, Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. You can see their lovely shiny campus here. It's where I met a number of people who are now my colleagues. You might recognize in some of these photographs, people who are not only my colleagues, but also now my family members. I met my partner on this program as well. And we now both work together at the University of Sheffield. So there's a really kind of nice opportunity, I think, to develop your life and your career on exchange programs in Japan. But also, you know, I feel like in as much as study abroad taught me a lot about Japanese culture, it also helped me refine my idea of what exactly it was that I was interested in and what exactly I wanted to know through this engagement with Japan. So again, if you're on a Japanese studies undergraduate program, you are probably gearing up again for one of those awkward Christmas dinner conversations where, you know, an uncle from some branch of the family that you don't see very often says, why are you studying Japanese? What would you want to know, you know, through Japanese studies degree that you can't learn through history or a politics degree? And I think this idea of sort of expanding your global horizons to allow you to see your own culture and your own life a little bit differently is one of those really invaluable things that you get through Japanese studies. You can tell your uncle that with or without a PowerPoint presentation, I guess. As I mentioned also, the scholarly kind of option is not the only way to deepen your engagement with Japan. We have a number of students, colleagues, and friends who've gone through the JET program, which I think people find really, really rewarding. And again, if you're sort of graduating and thinking about taking a little bit of time to just think about what you want to do next, something like a TEFL or CELTA qualification will always be a really useful stepping stone towards those kind of pathways. Assistant language teaching jobs in Japanese public schools or teaching jobs in private English conversation schools can also be really good ways just to kind of feel out your relationship to living in Japan and think a little bit about sort of what you might want to do next. I mentioned also a number of kind of stepping stones to working in Japan that, again, probably are offered to you regularly by your careers office and by your own teachers, but it's worth kind of flagging up that a number of the people in the Japanese studies landscape in the UK today have gone through the Daiwa Scholarship Program, which is a 19-month program of language study, work placement, and homestay, usually in Japan. And you can also sort of deepen your language tuition there. There are a number of internships also working on bringing people to Japan to get involved largely in kind of tourist industry or in hotel kind of industry. And of course, work and travel is becoming increasingly popular as well. So there are a number of job sites listed at the bottom of the slide that you might think of looking towards just to understand a little bit about the employment landscape in Japan as well. So moving on then to talk to you a little bit about employment, I was as shocked as anyone listening probably is, based on the number of times that I've told you that it took me a very long time to learn to speak Japanese to get my very first job in Japan. So when I graduated, the first job that I applied for actually was in Japan. You're probably aware that the hiring process for a lot of Japanese jobs takes quite a long time. So it actually took me about a year to get hired to this job. So I really didn't think that it was happening until I turned up for my first day at work. Another thing that I was not prepared for, not having studied Japanese employment culture, was that you don't actually get your contract until the first day of work. So that can feel a little bit unnerving, when you're sort of moving your whole life to another country and, getting leases on apartments and things like this, to still not have your contract in your hand. But it all panned out. I turned up on my first day of work as an assistant professor at Kyoto University, was given my contract, and was then kind of set free to do whatever I wanted, essentially, in the way of research. It was a very free environment. If you've visited or studied Kyoto University before, you might be familiar with the Jiyu no Kaze, or the wind of freedom that supposedly blows through Kyoto University. And it was a very free and enriching place to work. However, that job was actually what's called a fixed term contract. So it was for 5 years, and I wasn't quite sure what would happen next. And I thought it's probably important to use this time to really improve myself as much as I possibly can. And I thought, what are 2 things that I really need to improve? Well, I still at this point felt that I really, really needed to improve my Japanese language skills. And I also felt that I was consuming a lot of popular culture directed at people sort of my age. I was watching, a lot of TV shows, a lot of films, a lot of anime, reading a lot of manga. But I felt like I really didn't have much understanding of how people in different generational groups were living in Japan. And I felt like this was kind of related to my language problem, in that turning up in Kyoto, I found that, sometimes if someone sort of over 60 was addressing me in the street, I would find it a little bit difficult to understand what they were saying to me. So I thought it'd be really interesting to design a research project that would allow me to kind of fill in those gaps in my knowledge. I kind of thought, what are 2 things that I'm really scared of doing? I'm really scared of striking up conversations, completely outside of the structure of the workplace or a friendship group. And I'm quite scared of speaking to people that I think that I won't have anything in common with. So I designed this 4-year research project that involved interviewing and surveying elderly film fans as a way of kind of confronting some of those fears and trying to develop those parts of my understanding of Japan and Japanese language that I felt were really patchy. So I started this project about memories of elderly cinema audiences. I wanted to know from people who went to the cinema during the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, what the atmosphere was like, and also what the role of cinema in their everyday lives was, because I felt like it's, of course, very different to today when we have Netflix and a variety of ways of accessing different kinds of media. I was also very aware that, this was very difficult. So doing these kind of interviews and doing these kind of surveys, I found it very, very tiring. It took a lot out of me. I was really outside of my comfort zone. So I decided to build some elements into my project that were a little bit more within my comfort zone. And as I previously mentioned, I'd successfully worked with these film magazines and kind of more, I guess, like lowbrow materials as a way of kind of building up my confidence a little bit in working with Japanese language materials. So this time around, I did something very similar. I started collecting old fan-created materials, including things like these film journals, which were handmade and hand-drawn by film study groups in universities in Japan in the 1950s and 1960s. So this was kind of my archive when I got very tired of trying to have conversations or speak with people. I would kind of go back to my old kind of paper materials and just spend a little bit of time working with these. As I mentioned, I also ran surveys at local cinemas and museums. I can't quite believe I was ever allowed to do this, but this is the Kyoto Bunpaku Film Theatre. It's on the 3rd floor of the Kyoto Culture Museum on Sanjo Street. If you're ever going there, I'd recommend that you pop in. They let me set up this kind of strange organization of desks where I would try and grab people going in and out of the cinema and recruit them to my project. This is the only photograph I have of this setup, and I think it's a shame that I looked really skeptical about whether or not this is going to work. In the end, I did recruit over 100 people to my study, so it worked out okay. But this was another way of sort of trying to engage with everyday people and speak to them a little bit about sort of the role of cinema in their everyday lives. I joined a number of film clubs as well, mostly with the idea of sort of meeting elderly film fans and talking to them, but it was also a really great way to learn a lot about the history of the area that I was living in. So this is a building that I did not realize is actually really quite famous. It's right next to the Kinugasa campus of Ritsumeikan University. And it was designed and built by Motono Seigo, who was the father of the member of the film club who allowed the film club to meet in this house once a month for their film screenings and discussions. And it's actually designed according to kind of like an idea of 1920s Western building. And it was through visiting this film club and learning a little bit about this building that I learned that this whole area of Kyoto, apparently in the 1910s and 20s, had a kind of like European arts vibe and kind of built itself up a little bit as like the cultural European oriented arts quarter of Kyoto, which I would never really have noticed just from walking through the area. So I think this is another kind of example of how, you know, designing your life and your work to really bring you into contact with people that you would not normally kind of bump into in your everyday kind of life is a really interesting way of sort of enriching your understanding of Japan, and specifically, you know, kind of enriching your understanding of your local areas, as well as sort of what that tells you about Japan as a larger kind of space. And lastly, as I mentioned, I was really just so nervous about the interview part of this project, and I was really uncomfortable. and concerned about sort of my understanding of what people were going to be telling me. And so I was encouraged actually to think about different ways of turning this weakness into a project strength. And I came up with the idea of making a documentary film as part of my research project. So this allowed me to record people when I was interviewing them, obviously with their permission. And the editing process of putting this short film together actually, I think, really supercharged my understanding of Japanese language, and particularly how Japanese is spoken amongst this particular community of elderly people in northern Kyoto, because I spent so much time in the editing suite listening over and over and over again to kind of key sentences or particular parts of conversations that I thought would become part of the finished film. If you're interested in looking at that film, you can actually access it on Vimeo. It's called When Cinema Was King. And I can circulate a link to that through later materials if that's something that you would like to see. You can scan the subtitles for my language mistakes. So sort of wrapping up now, because I think we're going to move into the Q&A very shortly. Drawing just from very personal experience, and of course, every person is going to be different in how they engage with Japan and ideas of Japan. But thinking about this idea of trying to go beyond the stereotypes and how we push ourselves maybe outside of our comfort zones and what that might teach us, I found that working with a wide range of people in Japan, from academic colleagues through to these elderly film fans who participated in my research, taught me a lot about the diversity of lifestyles and cultures in Japan today. And I think then that one of the fastest ways to go beyond the stereotypes that we might have about Japan is to meet lots of different people and to engage with a wide range of cultural materials. And that's often going to involve going beyond your comfort zone, but I would say it's always really, really worth it. And one of the things that, you know, people have probably told you in every single one of these talks is not to underestimate just how friendly and engaging a lot of the people that you will meet in your engagement with Japan are going to be. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap up there. Hopefully there's a decent amount of time for Q&A now. I'll hand back over to our Cardiff hosts.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was a fascinating lecture. I enjoyed so much. So shall we move on to the Q&A box now? We have several questions, and you can upvote other people's questions and we can prioritize that question if you want. Okay, so I'm going to read this question from Alex. Do you think popular culture focused materials like eiga fan or modern equivalent are more useful or more pertinent resources than highbrow resources given the wider intended audience?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think this question about sort of intended audience, that's a really smart way to phrase it, because one of the things that I realized in my research is that I would sometimes make assumptions about how far a particular material had reached that would in the end not actually pan out. So definitely when I'm working with magazines, I would sometimes think, oh, well, you know, everybody must have been reading this, so everybody must have heard of this opinion or that opinion. But then when I speak to people who were engaged with those materials at the time, they would say, oh, I didn't notice that, or that wasn't really a major, you know, kind of buzzword in discussion at the time. So my personal feeling is that balance between your materials is always really important to understand exactly how far particular discourses are penetrating and amongst which kind of groups. But I think one of the things that popular culture materials like eiga fan can kind of give us, and possibly those of you who are working on gender related issues might see this as well when you're looking at things like mini komi or even like very specific communications for like closed groups, is that it's still really important to see what kind of discussions are happening even among kind of like smaller or less kind of politically central groups, because then we can understand a little bit about sort of different ways of talking about things than we might see in the mainstream kind of discussion. So I think one of my biggest bugbears is sometimes, you know, when you hear a politician say something in Japan, or even, you know, maybe a very famous director, and then you see it reported out maybe in British news as Japanese people think this, or, you know, Japanese people are worried about that. And you think, well, okay, this is just one high profile person speaking out about something is very different than what everyday people are concerned about. So I think it's always useful to think about sort of the limitations of what each material or each kind of example allows you to understand about Japan as a whole. But I guess the idea is that no single researcher answers that question, that we're contributing to a kind of like patchwork of a broader understanding of kind of a diverse Japan, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Jennifer. So let's move on to the next question from Caroline. Hi, Jennifer. I really liked your emphasis on finding a mode of study which works for the individual, like for you, using more visual materials to learn. Being very much into Japanese pop culture since a young age, I always utilize my passion for this part of the culture to motivate me to study the language as well. So I wonder about some practices or potentials of using anime or manga or other parts of Japanese pop culture for Japanese study. I had a Korean language textbook called Learning Korean with BTS or something similar, which I think is a brilliant approach. Do you know any similar examples of Japanese for Japanese language learning?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I'm going to defer to my colleagues who teach Japanese language on this one, because you will know much more than I do. But I suppose one of the things that we might be concerned about is that based on where we learn our Japanese, we might be giving an impression that we don't intend to give, right? And I think if I can zoom out for a second to think about how engaging with Japan can teach us something about ourselves, one of the things that I realized in struggling with my kind of like work persona in Japan, if that makes sense. So particularly in the first year of my job, I would sometimes get quite frustrated because I would feel like I wasn't communicating what I actually wanted to communicate, that what I was saying was sort of landing in a very different way, or I was giving a different impression than I would try to give. And I would call my dad and I would say, oh, my Japanese is so bad. I was just in this meeting and I tried to, you know, convince everybody to do this task this way. And nobody understood what I was saying. And, you know, they've just gone back to the old way, which is, you know, so frustrating. And he would tell me, that's not a Japan problem or a Japanese language problem, that is a work problem. And it was only when I moved to my second job in the UK that I realized he was right. This isn't just about how I communicate in Japanese. It's also about how I communicate in a work meeting. And so I had to learn to think a little bit about, you know, what kind of persona am I using for all these different parts of my life? And that made me think trying to have a coherent persona in Japanese is just as crazy as trying to have a coherent persona in English, because I'm going to want to talk in a different way in a formal meeting than I want to talk to my friends in a bar, or, you know, I'm going to speak differently to older people than I'm going to speak to people of my own age. So I guess one of the things that I would worry about a little bit if we use only one kind of resource to study a language is that we might come out with like a very one note sort of personality in that language, if that makes sense. When I was watching a lot of 1950s films, and particularly a lot of films with Hara Setsuko in them, one of my Japanese friends told me that I spoke Japanese the way that people in Gone with the Wind speak English, which is obviously not desirable, right? You don't want to be walking around talking like a period character or like a, you know, like you think you're a samurai or something like this. So I mean, I guess something like learning through visuals, it's definitely an attractive way to kind of engage with things beyond the language, but I'm not sure that, well, I don't speak Korean and I'm not a BTS fan, but it strikes me that learning Korean with BTS is going to give you some pretty repetitive Korean. And I would worry a little bit that perhaps like learning Japanese through anime or learning Japanese through manga would give you a form of Japanese that might not play so well in a business meeting, for example. But again, I think variety is really the key here, isn't it? Like trying to make sure that you actually build out those aspects of your life in Japan so that you have different places to kind of play with like different Japanese language persona.
Thank you, Jennifer. I've got additional information for Caroline. Caroline, sorry. I know the textbook, a Japanese textbook using material from Japanese popular culture that was published by Kuroshio Shuppan. So I am going to put the link, website address in this chat box. So if you're interested in, please check that. I think that for intermediate level proficiency of Japanese, so it might be very interesting for you. So I just texted that. I just put that information in the link. And then we have a question from Chris. So Chris, can you open the mic, please?
Thanks, Jenny, for that really interesting talk. I'm not sure how to phrase this question at one level, but and obviously you've done a combination of collecting surveys sometimes, interviewing people sometimes. How do you get to a point where you feel as though you really have a feel for what is going on? Because, I mean, as you said, there's an issue when we see news stories saying the Japanese do such and such, but we still end up having to generalize when we do our writing about Japan. How do you get to a point where you think actually this generalization is reflective of some sort of truth? I think that's about as good as I can do phrasing.
Yeah, no, that's such a difficult question, isn't it? And I think when it comes to research projects, most researchers probably feel like they're never actually done. Like it's always some outside factor that makes you think, right, I have to wrap up now, like your fieldwork time is ending. Or I mean, I think that I was really lucky with this project because 4 years is quite a long time to do sort of a project like this. And so it gives you that, you know, you've got that luxury of time, maybe that, for example, a PhD project doesn't give you. And so what I found in the end was there was a degree of repetition coming up that made me think, okay, I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I definitely have what you might call like the beats of my book project. So each of the keywords that was coming up again and again, I was thinking, well, these are actually starting to coalesce now into chapters. And so it was once I started to have that sense of, you know, you're interviewing someone and they're saying, well, what nobody knows about this period is this thing. And you're like, wow, okay, actually 5 people mentioned that this week. So there's at least some degree of consensus there in how important this thing is to people of this sort of period or culture, even if they all have very different takes on what it meant for them or what they did with it. But I would also say that I think it was maybe around like 9 months or so, I started to also get a sense of like mistakes and errors that I had built into the project. And then I went through a little phase where I was finding lots of my own mistakes, and then that kind of stopped. And it was once I had a period of not finding my own mistakes that I started to think, okay, so you've got some kind of clear data now. So for example, 2 big mistakes that I made in the early stages of the project design were about sort of gender and generation. So I had a couple of questions in my survey that were directed at sort of inviting people to imagine how the wartime generation saw particular film communications. And all of my study participants, they were aged between 75 and 95, and the kind of average year in which they were born was 1943. So I wasn't thinking of them as the wartime generation, because obviously if you're 2 when the war ends, what kind of memories do you have? But I realized from the questionnaire surveys that they were strongly identifying as the wartime generation. So I realized that I was asking a question basically where I thought I was inviting them to tell me what their parents or their older siblings thought, and they were telling me what they thought. So I realized that that was a big mistake that I'd made. The other thing, an early version of my survey started with a question about how often people went to the cinema. And I realized that I could not get women to fill in the survey. They were very happy to talk informally and to do interviews, but I could not get them to fill in the survey. And after I made some friends amongst my research participant group, one lady in her late 70s said, well, you know, like girls just didn't go to the cinema as often as boys. So probably women are reluctant to volunteer to take part in the survey because they don't feel that they're like expert witnesses in the same way as men might feel. And so I was accidentally like dissuading people from participating in the survey by just having that very simple question. So there were definitely those moments early on in the project where I had to rethink how I was doing things and like change my questions and rephrase my questions, but then they stabilized. And after a while, I found that I wasn't so surprised by the responses. And so that was when I started to think like, you know, you definitely haven't heard everything there is to hear about this, but like maybe you've reached like a kind of control like level, if that makes sense. And that was when I thought, okay, it's probably time to start thinking about how to write this up.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. And thank you very much for all those answers for those questions. And we need to close this session soon, unfortunately. And so I'll start the kind of closing now. Thank you so much. So thank you everyone for coming to the 8th Cardiff-Japanese Lecture Series. And the next webinar will be on the 9th of November. And this time we are going to invite Dr. Nozomi Abe. Dr. Abe is a translator and playwright. Oh, I need to share the screen, sorry. Where is it? I'm so sorry. Yeah. Yep. Yes. So yeah, can you see this? So next one is going to be on the 9th of November. And Dr. Abe is a translator, a playwright, and a theatre maker, and using Japanese and English languages. And he will give us the lecture titled Being a Professional Translator, and the link of the event page that's in chat box now already. And moreover, we'll be very, very grateful if you could complete the short survey to tell us how you found this lecture series, lecture today. And the survey will be automatically sent to you later. And please do not forget to check the Cardiff Japanese online lecture series, a YouTube channel. And then this Jennifer's webinar is going to be in our channel as soon as possible, within a week or something, within a week or 2 weeks. Okay, so yeah, so thank you, and thank you for coming to the lecture series, and I hope I'll see you next time on the 9th. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you so much, Jennifer. I'll see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye.